My name's Dr. Terrence Galvin, and I'm a founding director and professor at the MacEwan School of Architecture at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario. I have a parallel history here with the minimum cost housing program and with Vikram Bhatt in particular. I was a student at McGill, a graduate student in the late 1980s and early 90s in the history theory program. But as I started teaching in the design studio in the undergraduate program, Vikram and I started discussing and collaborating on some of the projects that are in this exhibition. What I think is very groundbreaking and pioneering about the entire minimum cost housing program is that it grew out of the ecology movement, clearly, in the 1970s, and a poster like this one that says some ways of building ecologically. If you just read the first one, building with renewable resources, such as timber or vegetable fibers, which do not consume the earth's stock of non-reusable materials. All of those 12 principles are with us now in more developed ways, back in, not in the so-called developing world, but back in Canadian cities, right? So wood and mass timber, as you know, is a major subject of all Canadian schools of architecture right now. And then Michael Green in Vancouver is looking at how to do a kind of new hybrid plant-based fiber, all different types of fibers, from hemp to straw to salal grasses and so on, in addition to timber. So in an interesting way, I am a student of the 1970s. I started architecture school in 1980, but I grew up reading and looking at the ecology movement like everybody in my generation. And what was groundbreaking and pioneering about the minimum cost housing group was that it turned that into a program looking at materials, looking at development issues in countries. And the brilliant thing in my mind was through Alvaro Ortega, who began the program. He was still here when I was a student in the late 80s, so I got to chat with him often, looking at materials like sea concrete, and many of the fabrications that they were doing were kind of reinventing materials. But from my perspective, it had a context of Architecture Without Architects by Bernard Rudofsky, you know, the entire ecology movement, like Rachel Carson writing Silent Spring. And then there's a body of literature, Housing by People by John Turner. They were a group at MIT, and MIT, you know, Canadian schools looked to MIT doing housing as another studio. So there was John Turner and John Habraken, and they had theories of housing and trying to deliver affordable housing in different contexts. And here, it really took from the ground up, now we would say that, rather than top-down design. So Vikram and I think Witold Rybczynski and Alvaro, they all had their feet planted firmly in working with communities, and that was what was radical. And now I think 40 years later, many of the schools' hands-on learning in Indigenous communities has come back into our curriculums, working with communities and getting students to go out and get field experience rather than to sit abstractly at a desk and kind of project architectural ideas on the world. That has all come, I would say, from my perspective in teaching, it's come full circle, but it started with programs like this.
Perfect.
Graduated through the minimum cost housing group, and I know many will be in and around for this symposium for the next 2 days. They made such a significant contribution because they were coming from those so-called poor countries, and books like How the Other Half Builds, right, that Witold and Vikram did in the 1980s, 84 I think, that was a parallel title to How the Other Half Builds by Jacob Riss, a really important sociological study. Architects that I was influenced by were people like the Team 10 architects like Aldo van Eyck and Peter Nallis and Smithson, and parallel again with that housing group at MIT and parallel to here, they were of course interested in the social values, and they had been, all of them were critiquing modernisms, you know, leaving places, creating places like Chandigarh and Brasilia and many other new capitals. And so there was a modernist architecture movement that we were all educated by, but what I started to really come to understand more fully here was that from the ground up, looking at the way people had built, you know, led to other books like Barefoot College by Bunker Roy later on throughout India. The Barefoot Architect is another text that we would know. And of course the Development Dictionary. So where I really kind of started to connect my work with Vikram and looking at projects that we were doing in development, it started to connect really well with studio. And so teaching undergraduate studio here for 5 years, we often had students go and do real projects like the Fingers of Hope project that is displayed here behind us. The publication is here, and some of the drawings are here. But Vikram and I developed a working relationship. As I say, I was a research associate, and when he was working with master's students and diploma students doing the minimum cost housing group work, we often went to other places, but we were testing those same ideas, the ecological materials, recycling waste, that eventually became kind of hacking and using all the things that were there as resources, which again goes back to architecture without architects or the prodigious builders. But for me, what's important is that now that we see it 40 years later, there's a continuity that began here with ecology, that looked at materials, that included the people, that went from the ground up and then went back to communities. So they were empowering themselves. The parallel to that is that people like Ivan Illich, who I ended up studying with at University of Pennsylvania, he really wrote extensively about the creation of scarcity that we know, right? So that poor countries were told by the world banks and the big corporations that they were somehow poor, right, and underdeveloped. But what's interesting about that is Illich says that creation of scarcity made those countries then feel like they had to somehow catch up, be modernized, and the Fingers of Hope title comes from the rebar that would stick up from buildings, right, all over the world that you see, where housing is half built and people are waiting to get it completed. So I had done a project in Peru before I met Vikram, through Technical University of Nova Scotia. We had spent 3 years with IDRC funding, that's Canadian government funding, to look at building in a material called kincha that was local material, straw-based. So when I came here, even though I was in the history theory program, my interest and work with Vikram was trying to bring students together, looking at vernacular practices, local materials. And then we started taking students out of the studio space into those field projects to do projects like this. So several projects happened. The first one was looking at Tribeni tissues, which was in India. It was a factory town. So we did 2 volumes called Patterns of Living that were studies in India. And then this project, Fingers of Hope, was part of, for 2 years, we managed to get the RAIC, the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada, to be able to fund us. So we had CEDA funding, Canadian International Development Agency, but the RAIC let us run a program. So we at McGill did a project, and 10 other universities got to go to different countries where they had partners. And again, now the notion was you had to be invited by your partners, right? You didn't just go to a country and say, I'm bringing you the answer in technology, or I'm bringing you progress. So that I saw that cycle also change. At first, CEDA used to send Canadians to go and bring the truth. Then it changed to having to have a partner, which makes full sense that you couldn't just go to a place. Then in later cycles of CEDA, before the program finally closed, it was about training students that were Canadian to come back and have resources and skills to be better practitioners and better students in the Canadian context, right? So actually improving Canadian cities. And then there's a whole branch of the work that led to the hack book and the work that Vikram and others have done in more recent years, looking at First Nation communities, but through a similar lens, in fact, the lens of looking at what was the resources locally, making inventories of that demonstrated time and time again that this idea of scarcity is a construct. The places might have a poor GDP or economy, but they were rich in materials and even richer in community capacity, right? So we started measuring things like human capacity and using that, we, meaning all the Canadian agencies, started recognizing that human capacity was really one of the key skill sets, but also one of the key resources. So looking at those projects, working in Mexico, then we did a NAFTA program where there were 2 universities in the States, 2 in Canada, and 2 in Mexico. And for 4 years, we had a NAFTA project that was funded from HRSTC, Human Resources Development Skills Canada. And that also let students exchange. Mexico students came and studied in Canada. It was McGill and Dalhousie, our 2 relationships with where I had gone to both places. And Vikram had colleagues in many of the other countries that we then would partner with and do work on the same kinds of questions. Local materials, what were the resources? And often what I loved about this program was that it didn't just stay in making reports. And this was part of the critique of Bunker Roy. At some point he said there's all these big reports, but really what we want to do is do projects in the field that explain what people are doing. Okay, sorry, that was long.
It's perfect.